When I saw the pile of unopened Christmas decorations in the corner, I realized I wasn't really in charge this year, I was just pretending. I shouldn't have been surprised. My husband's family had a way of showing up like a storm, their presence loud and insistent, and me caught somewhere between hospitality and exhaustion. This year, though, felt different. He was out of town, on vacation he'd planned months ago with a grin that never reached his eyes, and I was left holding the reins. "You've got this," he'd said, his voice airy, almost teasing, as he kissed my cheek and left with his suitcase. I should have felt relief, but instead, a knot of unease settled in my chest. The house smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, thanks to the wreath I'd put up a week ago, and the hum of the refrigerator mingled with the soft ticking of the old clock in the hall. I wandered from room to room, touching the edges of the couch, straightening the throw pillows, listening to the quiet. I wanted everything to be perfect for them, my in-laws, whose visits had always been a test of patience, subtle judgments, and quiet competitions I could never quite win. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam curling up and brushing my cheek, and I smiled at the thought that at least I had a few hours alone. No small talk about recipes I'd never made right, no questions about why I hadn't baked enough cookies, no sighs at the way I hung the stockings. It was supposed to be mine, this little corner of peace before the storm arrived. But even in this quiet, I could feel the tension stretching thin, like a thread ready to snap. My husband's phone buzzed repeatedly with cheerful texts about the vacation, photos of sunsets, cafes in a town I didn't know, smiling strangers. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth fill me, trying to shake the feeling that I was missing something. Something important. By late morning, I started unpacking the boxes of Christmas decorations I'd shoved into the attic months ago. There were ribbons, tiny figurines, a string of lights that had somehow become tangled in a way that felt personal, almost insulting. I hummed a little tune to myself, a tradition from my childhood, the notes soft against the hum of the refrigerator. It helped, for a while, until I noticed a folded piece of paper lying at the bottom of one box. It was a note, in my husband's handwriting, that I hadn't seen before. "If anything goes wrong, just remember, you're in charge." I laughed softly, a little bitterly, shaking my head. In charge, I muttered to myself, thinking about the looming presence of his family, who had a habit of turning every home into their territory, no matter how well-intentioned my preparations might be. The thought of them arriving, bustling through the kitchen, critiquing my choices, filled me with a mix of dread and frustration. The afternoon passed in a blur of mundane tasks. I hung the wreaths, dusted the shelves, and arranged the ornaments just so. I even lit the scented candles, letting their soft glow reflect off the glass ornaments, imagining a scene that was calm, warm, and perfect. I kept glancing at the clock, feeling the minutes stretch like elastic. Soon, very soon, they would be here. I opened the window for a breath of cold December air, the chill pressing against my cheeks and stirring something uneasy in my stomach. Then I heard it, a soft thud from the driveway. I froze. My heart beat faster. Surely, it was too early. And then the car door slammed, the kind of slam that carried authority, confidence, and a hint of challenge. I knew that sound. I had heard it countless times over the years, marking the arrival of my husband's family, the storm I'd been trying to prepare for in silence. I braced myself, took a deep breath, and whispered, "All right. Let's see what I'm really in charge of." The doorbell rang. The chime of the doorbell was almost ceremonial, a warning bell, and I found myself hesitating before I stepped forward. I could hear the familiar shuffle of heavy boots on the porch, the murmur of voices I knew too well. My mother-in-law, sharp as ever, and my husband's sister, whose laugh could slice through any pretense of calm, were the front-runners of the incoming chaos. I opened the door, forcing a smile that felt like a mask stretched too tight. "Welcome. Come in," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the hallway. The smell hit me immediately, a mix of perfume, damp coats, and the faint, insistent aroma of their packed casseroles. My eyes caught my mother-in-law first. She stepped inside, surveying the living room with the kind of scrutiny reserved for art critics. Well, it smells festive, she said, her voice polite but laced with judgment. I see you've made an effort. There was a pause, long enough to make me question whether I had actually. My hands instinctively smoothed the edges of the sofa cushions. Her daughter, the sister, followed closely, plopping down on the arm of the couch. It's cute, she said, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. But the lights? They're all over the place. I would have done it differently. She didn't wait for a response, already moving on to inspect the mantel, her eyes flicking over my carefully arranged figurines. I swallowed, forcing calm into my voice. I thought a little randomness would make it feel homey. Homey, she repeated, raising an eyebrow. Interesting choice. My husband's younger brother arrived soon after, his presence quieter but no less significant. He carried himself as though he were neutral ground in a war I didn't agree to fight. I offered him a smile, he nodded, more amused than sympathetic. We sat together in the living room after they had unloaded their bags, the conversation a mix of small talk and subtle critiques. Every word, every laugh, every glance seemed calibrated to unsettle me. I could feel it under my skin, the way the air became heavier, and my sense of calm from the morning was evaporating like steam. Then came the first small clue that something was off. While helping my mother-in-law with her casserole, I noticed her phone light up. She glanced at it, her eyes narrowing slightly, and she smiled, but not at anything I could see. There was a tension in her posture, a quiet calculation, and for a moment, it unsettled me. I shook it off, thinking perhaps it was nothing. She had always been a woman who carried secrets behind her perfume and carefully chosen words. Later, in the kitchen, I overheard my husband's sister on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. Her voice was tight, clipped, and careful. I couldn't make out the words, but the energy was unmistakable. I felt a prickle of suspicion, a quiet alarm ringing in my chest. Something wasn't right. I tried to focus on dinner prep, the chopping of vegetables, the stir of sauces, the comforting rhythm of culinary routine, but my mind kept wandering. My husband's absence, which had initially felt like freedom, now felt like exposure. I was vulnerable, surrounded by family whose approval I craved yet could never secure. By the time evening rolled around, the house was buzzing with the sound of laughter, clinking silverware, and a television murmuring faint holiday music in the background. I carried the tray of desserts to the living room, trying to keep my hands steady. And that's when I noticed it, my mother-in-law's gaze, sharp and deliberate, locked on something behind me. I turned, following her eyes, and my stomach dropped. A small, wrapped box had appeared on the coffee table, one I didn't remember placing there. It was addressed to my husband, but the handwriting wasn't his. I picked it up cautiously, feeling the weight of something hidden, something secret. The holiday cheer around me suddenly felt hollow, the warmth of cinnamon and pine replaced with a cold uncertainty. My mind raced. Who had left this here? Why? And, most importantly, what would it mean when my husband returned? I glanced at them casually, trying not to let the suspicion show, but I could feel it already, the undercurrent of something waiting to erupt. The family dinner, the laughter, the warm light of the candles, all of it felt like a stage, and I was only beginning to realize that I was a character in a play whose script I didn't yet understand. I set the box down on the coffee table, trying to act casual, but the weight of it anchored my thoughts. My mother-in-law had retreated to her favorite armchair, the one that seemed to claim any room the moment she entered, and she was busy fiddling with her napkin, pretending to be absorbed in conversation. My husband's sister had flopped onto the couch, scrolling through her phone, lips pursed in concentration. Everyone looked so ordinary, so unassuming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, a subtle undercurrent I wasn't meant to notice. After clearing the dishes from the living room, I retreated to the kitchen, pretending to check on the pie in the oven. My fingers brushed the edges of the counter, tracing the familiar grooves, but I wasn't present. My mind kept returning to that small box. The handwriting, curved, deliberate, feminine, was nothing like my husband's. Whoever had left it here wanted something kept hidden. And in my gut, I knew it wasn't just a gift. I tried to focus on dinner preparations, chopping carrots and stirring sauces, but every sound from the living room, the scrape of a chair, the low murmur of conversation, felt amplified. I caught glimpses of their interactions, subtle looks, small smiles exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. A shared joke? Or a shared secret? My pulse quickened. Later, while I arranged the dessert tray for the living room, I overheard a snippet of conversation that made my stomach twist. "Don't worry, she'll never notice." "Not until it's too late," my husband's sister whispered, her voice low, almost a hiss. I froze, the spatula trembling in my hand. Too late for what? I tried to dismiss it, tried to convince myself it was probably about some mundane household detail, some trivial holiday surprise. But the words lingered like smoke in the air, and I couldn't shake them. I glanced at my mother-in-law, but she was speaking animatedly about a recipe, laughter spilling from her lips. Normal, ordinary, innocent. Or was it? By the time dessert was served, I couldn't ignore the tension anymore. I lingered near the edge of the living room, pretending to pour coffee, watching their interactions. Every subtle glance, every shared laugh, every small touch I didn't understand, it was as if they were performing, communicating in a secret language I wasn't yet fluent in. When the last bite of pie was eaten and the coffee cup sat steaming on the tray, I finally excused myself. I needed air, a moment to clear my head. Outside, the winter night pressed cold against my face, and the scent of snow and evergreens was sharp and grounding. I breathed deeply, trying to push away the creeping unease. But even out there, I couldn't escape it. I kept thinking about that box. My hands itched to open it, to uncover whatever secret was hidden inside, but part of me feared the truth. Fear of what I might find. Fear of confirming the suspicions curling tighter in my chest. I returned inside, trying to act composed, when I noticed my husband's phone sitting on the kitchen counter, forgotten, buzzing quietly. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Maybe a message would explain it, a casual note from him or his sister. Maybe it would calm the gnawing anxiety. I unlocked it. And that's when I saw it, a string of messages, brief and precise, between my husband and someone whose name made my heart stumble. The words weren't overtly threatening, but the intent was unmistakable. Plans, secret meetings, whispered intentions. Every tap and swipe on that screen felt like peeling back a layer of my carefully constructed reality, exposing the fragility beneath. I closed the phone, my hands shaking slightly. I felt dizzy, the room tilting ever so slightly. The laughter and clinking from the living room sounded distant now, like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. My husband was away, and yet here was evidence that he wasn't entirely honest with me, or perhaps that he never had been. I sank onto the kitchen chair, pressing my hands to my face. I tried to breathe, tried to remind myself to stay calm, but my mind raced ahead, imagining the confrontation, imagining the betrayal. The holiday warmth I had worked so hard to create felt like a cruel joke now, a backdrop to secrets I was only beginning to understand. And I realized, with a sinking certainty, that I was no longer just in charge of Christmas. I was in charge of unraveling the truth. I couldn't sit there any longer. I needed answers. My hands still trembled as I picked up the mysterious box from the coffee table. It was light, unassuming, wrapped in plain paper with a red ribbon. I untied it slowly, as if the motion itself could somehow control the impact of what I might find inside. My heart thumped so loudly that I thought they might hear it through the walls. Inside was a small stack of photographs and a folded piece of paper. The photographs were innocuous at first glance, pictures of my husband, smiling, casual, completely normal. But then I noticed her. A woman I didn't recognize, leaning too close, laughing too freely, hand brushing against his arm. The kind of closeness that belonged in a life outside mine, a life I hadn't been invited to. My hands fell to my lap, the paper trembling in my grip. I unfolded it carefully, as though touching it lightly might lessen the betrayal it contained. It was a note. Brief, deliberate, confident. Can't wait to see you tonight. Don't tell her. I stared at it for a long moment, disbelief rooting me to the spot. My stomach twisted, a mix of anger, hurt, and shock coursing through me. My husband, who was supposed to be away, supposed to be enjoying his vacation, supposed to be my partner, had been planning something behind my back. Planning something secret. I tried to breathe. I reminded myself of all the times I had trusted him, of all the quiet mornings and small acts of care. I reminded myself that he wasn't here, that there was still time to figure this out. But every rational thought collided with the sinking realization, he had been lying. And worse, someone in this house, the people I was supposed to trust, knew. I returned to the living room, the box clutched to my chest like a lifeline. They were all still there, oblivious to the storm brewing in my mind. My mother-in-law was humming as she rearranged some ornaments. My husband's sister was scrolling through her phone again, that same look of concentration, that same quiet satisfaction. I caught her eyes for a brief moment, and they flicked away too quickly, almost guiltily. I realized then that the clues had been there all along, the whispered conversations, the subtle smiles, the strange energy I couldn't name. I had ignored them, telling myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. And now, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to confront someone, to force the truth out into the open. But who? My mother-in-law seemed untouchable, a master of control and propriety. Her daughter, my husband's sister, seemed like the instigator, the one orchestrating the subtle chaos around me. But confronting her without proof would make me look irrational. And my husband, he was away, unreachable, blissfully unaware, or maybe aware and complicit. I excused myself to the bedroom, the quiet hum of the heater filling the space. I sank onto the bed, letting the box fall beside me, feeling the weight of every secret it contained. My mind replayed every interaction of the afternoon, the hushed whispers, the exchanged glances, the way my husband's sister had lingered too long near the coffee table where the box now sat. And then I noticed something else. There, half hidden under the nightstand, was another envelope. My name was written on it, my husband's handwriting, neat, familiar, and unmistakable. My fingers shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. I didn't want to ruin Christmas for you. But there's something I need to tell you. Trust me, not everyone has your best interest at heart. Read carefully. My hands trembled as I read the words. Carefully, I opened the envelope, revealing a series of receipts, notes, and small messages that detailed not only a secret meeting but also a web of manipulations involving his family, gifts, favors, and whispered instructions, all designed to control the way Christmas unfolded in my home. The betrayal hit me in waves. Not just from my husband, but from the people I had thought were family allies. The people who were supposed to love and respect me had been quietly undermining me, testing my patience, mocking my efforts, orchestrating something behind my back while I poured my heart into preparing a celebration for them. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. I needed clarity first. I needed to decide how I would act, how I would respond, and how I would protect myself without losing my dignity in the process. Because now, Christmas wasn't about decorations or food. It wasn't about laughter or tradition. It was about trust, broken, hidden, and now demanding confrontation. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the heater, the creaks of the house settling around me. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow in the room seemed to whisper secrets. My mind replayed the discovery over and over, the box, the photographs, the notes. I could feel my pulse in my temples, a steady drum of anxiety and determination. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to explode, not yet. I needed to act carefully, strategically, and with a precision that would reveal the truth without allowing my emotions to control me. I would be clever, not vengeful, measured, not reckless. I started with small observations, watching their movements, listening to their conversations, noting patterns. My mother-in-law fussed over the breakfast table, directing who should sit where and how the silverware should be arranged. Her daughter hovered nearby, pretending to help but really testing me, pushing subtle boundaries, letting small criticisms slip into her tone, like invisible needles. I caught her whispering again, this time while pretending to straighten a tablecloth. The words were faint, but the intent unmistakable, she's suspicious. We have to move fast. It hit me that they knew I had begun noticing, that my careful composure had cracked. That knowledge alone made me sharper, more focused. I decided the next step would be to gather indisputable evidence. I had already found the box and the note, but I needed more. I needed them to expose themselves fully, to show the web of secrets they were trying to weave around me. I started by accidentally leaving my husband's phone on the counter, in plain view, as if I were unaware. Then I positioned myself nearby under the guise of cleaning up, pretending to arrange utensils while listening intently. It didn't take long. My husband's sister picked up the phone, thinking I was occupied. She scrolled through messages, tapping eagerly, laughing softly when she thought no one was watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe too heavily. Every word she typed, every chuckle, every glance at her mother, all of it was now being catalogued in my mind, stored for confrontation. Later, I approached my mother-in-law casually while she brewed tea. You know, I said, letting the tone of conversation drift innocently, I found this note. I held it loosely in my hand, the photograph of my husband with the unknown woman peeking out just enough for her to see. Her smile faltered. Just for a fraction of a second, that imperious, unshakable expression cracked. I held my gaze. Interesting handwriting, I added lightly, don't you think? She recovered quickly, but I saw it, the flicker of recognition, the small tightening around her eyes. I felt a rush of triumph, tempered by careful control. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't accusing. I was exposing, subtly, allowing her to respond to the evidence without me having to force the truth. By evening, the atmosphere had shifted. The family moved carefully around me, smiles a little tighter, conversations slightly more deliberate. My husband was still away, oblivious, but the energy in the house was charged. They had realized that I was no longer unaware, that I was no longer passive. And that gave me leverage. When dessert was brought out that night, I took a deep breath and addressed the group casually, as if making conversation. You know, I said, gesturing to the table, it's funny how certain surprises can appear when you least expect them. I didn't point to the box, but everyone knew I was referring to it. My mother-in-law's eyes flicked to her daughter, then back to me. A subtle tension hung in the air, almost tangible, like static before a storm. I could see the cracks forming. A whispered word here, a careful avoidance there. They were adjusting, calculating, realizing that the control they had always wielded over me was slipping. And I felt something I hadn't in a long time, power. Not cruel power, but the quiet, steady power of someone who had discovered the truth and could now navigate it with dignity. That night, as the house quieted and I prepared for bed, I realized I had won the first round, not with anger, not with shouting, but with careful observation, patience, and strategy. The betrayal had been exposed to the edges of the family dynamic, and I had positioned myself not as the victim, but as the one who understood the rules of this hidden game. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was tense but quiet. Breakfast was a careful performance, everyone polite, controlled, measured. Even my mother-in-law, who usually commanded the room, spoke in clipped sentences, her usual warmth replaced by cautious precision. I felt a quiet satisfaction, but I knew this was only the beginning. The full consequences had yet to unfold. I decided it was time to let the truth gently ripple outward. The first move was subtle. I mentioned, in passing, to a cousin who had arrived unannounced, that I'd found a little surprise while decorating. I didn't elaborate, but the way I smiled, calm and knowing, carried a weight that immediately caught the attention of my mother-in-law and her daughter. The cousin raised an eyebrow, curious, and asked, "What kind of surprise?" "Oh, just some unexpected messages," I said lightly, as if talking about the weather. "Nothing serious, but interesting to see how carefully plans can be made behind someone's back. I let my eyes linger on them for just a beat too long. The effect was immediate. My mother-in-law's hands froze mid-pour, her daughter's smile faltered, and the cousin looked from one to the other with a puzzled curiosity. Small whispers began circulating, almost imperceptible, but I could feel them gathering momentum. By midday, the ripple had reached a wider circle. Word spread carefully, like a trail of dominoes. Someone mentioned that a secret had been discovered, that there was more going on behind the cheerful facade than anyone had realized. Guests who had arrived later looked at me with quiet deference, their glances acknowledging that I was no longer just the hostess. They could sense that I had seen behind the curtain. My husband's family could feel it too. They had always relied on subtle manipulation, on controlling situations without confrontation, but now the balance had shifted. I observed my mother-in-law withdrawing from certain conversations, her voice softer, less commanding. My husband's sister avoided eye contact, busying herself with trivial tasks to keep from speaking. Even my younger brother-in-law, usually the neutral observer, began to mirror my cautious calm, watching his family with new awareness. The pivotal moment came that afternoon when I decided to accidentally leave the box on the coffee table again, this time in a more public spot, near the center of the living room. I quietly stepped back, pretending to adjust a cushion, and watched. It didn't take long. My husband's sister approached, hands brushing over the box as if by accident, but her hesitation betrayed her. She glanced at her mother, who froze mid-step, and then quickly looked away. The tension was palpable, a taut wire stretched between us all. In that small gesture, the truth was no longer hidden, it was acknowledged, silently, visibly, and undeniably. By evening, my husband's family had begun to confront their own discomfort. Small comments were made, apologies offered, explanations fumbled. My mother-in-law spoke carefully, almost defensively, as if trying to reclaim authority. But the shift was permanent. Where once she had subtly dictated the terms of our interactions, now she had to negotiate, to account for my presence, my knowledge, my quiet confidence. Even the dinner table felt different. Conversations were polite, yes, but I could see the self-consciousness in their expressions, the careful choice of words, the restrained laughter. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone, for the first time, understood that I was no longer simply a participant in their games. I had become a player of my own design. By the end of the day, I felt a quiet sense of triumph, tempered by reflection. The consequences had been social, gentle yet firm, and delivered without cruelty. My husband's family had faced the reality of exposure, and I had maintained my dignity throughout. The lesson was clear: truth, once recognized and handled with patience and intelligence, has a way of asserting itself even in a room dominated by control and manipulation. I walked through the quiet house later that night, the soft glow of the Christmas lights casting long shadows. The air smelled faintly of pine and lingering coffee, the sounds of distant laughter still echoing softly. I allowed myself a small smile. The storm had passed, at least for now, and I had navigated it with care, awareness, and quiet strength. The days that followed were calmer, though not entirely quiet. The house had settled into a new rhythm, one where I felt present and in control, rather than constantly defending my space or my feelings. My husband's family no longer operated as a united front against me. They moved more cautiously, measured their words, and, most importantly, recognized that I was no longer naive about their ways. I spent the mornings preparing meals, not as a performance but as a genuine act of care, enjoying the sound of chopping vegetables, the warmth of the oven, the smell of cinnamon and vanilla drifting through the house. I allowed myself to breathe in these ordinary moments, appreciating the small victories, a genuine compliment from my sister-in-law, a nod of approval from my mother-in-law, quiet laughter that wasn't weighted with hidden meaning. When my husband returned from his vacation, I was ready. I had taken the time to gather the evidence, to process my emotions, and to prepare for a conversation that was honest, calm, and unflinching. We sat together in the living room, the Christmas lights casting a soft glow on the polished wood floors. I placed the box and the notes between us, watching him carefully. He looked surprised at first, then guilty, then defensive, but I remained steady. I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I simply laid out the facts, the photographs, the messages, the note, the subtle manipulations I had observed. I let the evidence speak for itself, my voice calm, measured, unshakable. I need to know the truth, I said finally, meeting his eyes. Not just for me, but for this family, for what we share. I've learned that trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it doesn't fix itself automatically. He stumbled over his words, tried explanations that felt half-hearted, half-hidden. I listened, quietly, with the full weight of the weeks behind me, the observations, the suspicions, the slow burn of realization. And then I spoke again. I forgive you for your mistakes, but forgiveness doesn't erase the need for honesty. I need you to understand that. I need you to commit to truth, to respect, and to transparency if we are going to move forward. It was a long conversation, layered with emotion, reflection, and a growing sense of understanding. By the time it ended, there was no grand resolution, no dramatic declarations of eternal loyalty, but there was clarity. There was acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and there was the seed of rebuilding. The family, witnessing these subtle shifts and the newfound honesty, began to follow suit. Interactions became warmer, gentler. The old dynamics, the subtle critiques, the whispered competitions, softened. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was human. And it was a start. By the final days of the holiday, I found myself sitting by the tree, sipping tea, listening to the hum of conversation in the kitchen. My heart felt lighter. The house smelled of pine, baked apples, and the faint hint of candles. My husband moved around the kitchen, helping quietly, no grand gestures, just presence and attentiveness. I reflected on everything I had learned over the past week, that patience and observation can be more powerful than confrontation, that truth will surface if given the right space, and that maintaining dignity, even in the face of betrayal, allows one to reclaim control over life and family. I realized that Christmas, once a battleground of subtle manipulations, had become a lesson in boundaries, awareness, and quiet resilience. I allowed myself a smile, a small, private acknowledgement of strength. This holiday, I had not only preserved the celebration but had also reclaimed my place, my authority, and my peace. The warmth of the room mirrored the warmth I now felt inside, a reminder that even after betrayal, life could continue, richer for the lessons learned and the trust rebuilt. The last morning of the holiday arrived softly, with sunlight spilling through the curtains and dust motes dancing in its warmth. The house felt different now, lighter, calmer, as if the tension that had hung over the previous days had finally lifted. My husband and I moved quietly through the kitchen together, preparing breakfast without fanfare, a simple rhythm of cooperation and mutual awareness. I paused by the tree, fingers brushing over the ornaments I had carefully arranged, remembering how fragile everything had felt just days ago. The decorations, the gifts, the laughter, all of it had been a stage for secrets and subtle power plays. But now, they reflected a different story, a story of resilience, patience, and the quiet assertion of truth. I caught my husband's gaze across the room, and for a moment, there was understanding. No need for elaborate words, just recognition of what had happened, and acknowledgement of the effort it took to rebuild trust. The family, too, moved with a newfound respect, their energy no longer heavy with manipulation but tempered by awareness. I took a deep breath, letting the scent of pine and fresh coffee fill my lungs. Christmas, I realized, was never just about presents or perfect decorations. It was about connection, honesty, and the courage to stand firm when boundaries were tested. I had learned, painfully but clearly, that peace isn't given, it's earned, through observation, reflection, and sometimes quiet confrontation. As the day unfolded, I found moments of warmth, laughter shared without hidden motives, small gestures of kindness, a cup of tea passed with genuine care. I allowed myself to savor these ordinary but profound moments, knowing that this was the real gift of the season. And in the quiet of the evening, when the house settled and the last lights twinkled softly, I whispered to myself, almost like a confession, I am stronger than I realized. I am in control of my own story. And I will never forget what I have learned. Would you have had the courage to stand your ground like I did? To see through the quiet manipulations, confront the truth, and still maintain your dignity? Christmas is more than a celebration, it's a test of patience, perception, and strength. If you've faced something similar in your own life, share your story in the comments below. Your experiences can inspire others to recognize the power of quiet courage, the importance of honesty, and the strength that comes from trusting yourself.